On January 16th, 2025, Bloomberg's Jason Schreier reported that Sony had canceled 2 long-in-development projects from a pair of their first-party studios. Quote, "The games at Oregon-based Bend Studio and Texas-based Bluepoint Games were both live service projects designed to draw recurring revenue from players." A Sony spokesperson confirmed the cancellations. In a statement, the spokesperson said the 2 games were canceled, quote, "following a recent review," and that, quote, "PlayStation will continue making both online and single-player games." These 2 projects are major losses to PlayStation's upcoming lineup and morale-crippling cancellations for the hundreds of developers working at Bend and Bluepoint. Unfortunately, they are only the tip of the iceberg that is Sony's mismanagement of their talent over the course of the PS5 generation. Today, we'll explore the 3 reasons that I consider this generation to be lost. Not in terms of units sold, but in terms of creativity and passion wasted. First, we'll look back at the misguided new direction for PlayStation's first-party lineup. Second, we'll discuss the studios that were shuttered during the fallout, and finally, of course, we'll go through the numerous games that were canceled as a result, all in the last 5 years. To do that, we need to go way back to the long-lost age of 2022, when a shift in direction signaled a ship on the way to certain doom. The news broke on February 2nd of 2022. PlayStation's future was live service. According to Eurogamer, transcribing a quote from PlayStation's investor briefing, interim CEO Hiroki Totoki said that, quote, "Through close collaboration between Bungie and PlayStation Studios, we aim to launch more than 10 live service games by the fiscal year ending March 2026. This news wasn't really received well by PlayStation's core fanbase, as the publisher's strong history with high-quality, narrative-driven single-player games like God of War, Uncharted, and Horizon is what had gained them such a dedicated following and brought them back to the top of the industry during the PS4 generation. This push for live service was clearly driven by their $3.6 billion acquisition of Bungie, which occurred just days before this announcement was made. PlayStation clearly had high hopes for this new initiative, which was supposed to be strengthened by Bungie's decade worth of live service experience working on the Destiny series. We got our first glimpse at what this new strategy would hold in the PlayStation Showcase on May 24th, 2023, where the only new games revealed from PlayStation Studios were multiplayer shooters. The show opened on the announcement of Fair Games, a still unreleased multiplayer heist shooter from the then newly founded and acquired team Haven Studios. It wasn't received with the most fanfare, being criticized for a perceived lack of identity and for feeling similar to the last series that Haven studio director had produced with Ubisoft, Watch Dogs. Fair Games' reveal was followed up by Arrowhead's Helldivers 2 and Firewalk's ill-fated Concord, and finally they closed on Bungie's Marathon reboot, another project that, like Fair Games, hasn't re-emerged in 2 years. These 4 games represented this new live service direction for PlayStation, signaling that it was more than just talk. That controversial PlayStation Showcase wasn't where the worry started in 2023 though, as just a few weeks earlier, Sony had confirmed that they would be shutting down their small, passionate studio Pixel Opus after making 2 imaginative single-player games and less than a decade after being founded. The closure of this unique team, who had brought PS4 gamers both Entwined and Concrete Genie, was another nail in the coffin for Sony's weirder teams after they disbanded Japan Studio in 2021. These 2 teams being shuttered indicated just one thing: if you're not making Sony boatloads of money, you have to go. Japan Studio and Pixel Opus wouldn't be the last branches of PlayStation's family tree to be pruned, as the culling continued into 2024 with the closure of 3 teams. Concord's development team, Firewalk Studios, acquired just months before in 2023, PlayStation's only mobile-focused group called Neon Koi, and the storied London studio, who had been delivering unique projects for over 20 years. Between these 5 teams, PlayStation laid off hundreds upon hundreds of their team members and canceled numerous projects, making it clear that their future was in big-budget games with as little creative risk as possible. Let's explore these canceled projects that I'm sure you're all here to hear about. By my count, at least 7 games have been canceled by Sony in the last 3 years, all in different stages of development. First to go was Pixel Opus' game, which had been in development since at least 2020, after the release of Concrete Genie in 2019. That 3 years of development time was significant to a team like Pixel Opus, since their last game took 5 years to create. We likely would have seen their new game, which was to be made in collaboration with Sony Pictures Animation, in 2025 or 26, and it would have contributed a needed injection of style and variety that Sony's current lineup largely lacks. Next, let's talk about a current pair of elephants in the room: Bend and Bluepoint. Bend Studios' last 15 years have been tumultuous, being placed onto a variety of other studios' IP like Resistance and Uncharted, before working for almost a decade to get Days Gone out the door. By all accounts, they had been working on a new live service shooter IP, following rumors which indicated they may have been involved with the new Uncharted game, as well as a pitch for a Days Gone sequel. But with at least 6 years of time now scrapped between pitches and canceled projects, it's unlikely that we'll see a game from them on PS5. Bluepoint was in a slightly different situation, as they were, according to Jason Schreier, tasked with making a live service God of War game after assisting with the development of Ragnarok from 2020 until 2022. The announcement of that live service God of War game's existence and cancellation came as a big blow to the PlayStation community, as the mysterious next project from Bluepoint had long been one of the most compelling mysteries surrounding PS5's first-party lineup. It's little wonder that this live service God of War game didn't make it past the finish line, though, as not only is the live service push being reevaluated after the failure of Concord, but also because Bluepoint's skills were in developing high-quality remakes, not in creating original live service design. Quickly, I'll mention the live service Spider-Man spin-off that was to be made by Insomniac, which had the working title The Great Web. It's important to note that the only reason we know about this game at all is because of a hacking attack that impacted Insomniac in late 2023, which gave the public insight into game production knowledge that was never meant to be shared. This project was intended to be a Spider-Verse-inspired multiplayer game, though it seems like it never got out of the conceptual phase. Because this game received comparatively little development time, it's a little bit difficult to compare it with the other projects mentioned here, but its cancellation is worthy of note because it's in line with the larger trend of walking back live service plans across the PlayStation Studios family. One of the most mysterious canceled projects of the bunch would have come from London Studio, which was abandoned alongside their closure in 2024. The game had been in the works, much like Pixel Opus' game, since at least 2020, after London's last project, Blood and Truth, released in 2019 for PSVR. The scant details shared about their cancelled project indicated that it was to be a live service game set in a fantasy version of London, which was shown in a few pieces of concept art. London's history as genre-hopping experimenters gives me more faith that this would have been something interesting, and I would have loved to have seen a new major IP from PlayStation, as this game would likely have been released in 2025 or 26 as well. Another intriguing cancelled game was a rumored live service reboot of Twisted Metal, which had a complicated history before ultimately being cancelled in early 2024. While reporting around this game's cancellation indicated that it was in early development at Sony-owned team Firesprite, the leaked game allegedly found its way to Firesprite after having been unsuccessfully worked on for 3 years at another studio. Reporting from Andy Robinson in 2021 indicated that Lucid had been given the project, after the release of their launch-era PS5 game Destruction All-Stars, and that the game was planned to at least somewhat coincide with the Twisted Metal Peacock series that eventually released in 2023. It's unclear what stage in development this game reached at either Lucid or Firesprite, but its abandonment unfortunately leaves a sweet tooth-shaped hole still burning in PlayStation's modern library. Lastly, and probably most infamous, is The Last of Us Online. This live service game from Sony's crown jewel studio Naughty Dog is the only one on this list that was ever discussed in a public and official capacity. Its concept was shared, along with some art, at the closing announcement in Jeff Keighley's 2022 Summer Game Fest. The game had been in some form of development since before the release of Last of Us Part 2, as it was initially pitched as a side mode in that game, but grew to be its own project. Naughty Dog shared their frustration at the game's cancellation, saying, quote, "We're equally crushed at the studio as we were looking forward to putting it in your hands." This game was certainly going to be one of the defining games of the PS5 generation, as Naughty Dog's legacy, the popularity of the franchise, and the high fan demand for a multiplayer Last of Us game all certainly indicated. It's important to note that while we as PlayStation players are impacted by the cancellation of these games, which have contributed to a greatly decreased output of first-party titles this generation, the true consequence of all these abandoned projects and mismanaged studios is the time, talent, and morale lost at each of these studios. Imagine being a team member at Bend, Naughty Dog, Bluepoint, Firewalk, Neon Koi, Pixel Opus, Japan Studio, Firesprite, or Insomniac. After years of developing top-class work on PlayStation-published games, your team is given a new directive. Deliver a game in a genre you're not familiar with that is designed to pull as much money from your customers as possible. While that directive surely came as a shock to you and your team, you buckled down and did your best with what you were given. Bluepoint committed to making original content for the first time in the studio's history. Bend began work on a new IP, something players feel is sorely missing from the modern PlayStation. Your team worked for years on your project, trusting that the successful release of your game would push you to greater heights, only to have the rug pulled out from under you. Years of work to be written off as a tax break. In the worst scenarios, these teams were totally disbanded, as we mentioned earlier with London, Firewalk, Neon Koi, Pixel Opus, and Japan Studio. But even for the teams that remained intact, the impact that this has had on morale can't be understated, as years' worth of their time and effort will never see the light of day. Even beyond that, these closures, cancellations, and directives impact the wider PlayStation Studios family by increasing the pressure to deliver on the projects that survive. Put yourself in the mindset of a creator working at Media Molecule, years away from your next release after a decade of working on dreams which ultimately underperformed. Or someone at Housemarque, whose creative energy and commercial success level was mirrored in the now-defunct Pixel Opus. Imagine, in this environment, being a member of the fledgling Haven Studio, working on an untested, live service original IP. You watch the hammer of cancellation be brought down on studios decades your senior, With games based on trusted IP like The Last of Us, God of War, and Twisted Metal. You see the fate of your sister studio Firewalk after PlayStation pulled the plug on Concord less than 2 weeks into its time on the market. Would you feel confident that your job is safe? That the game you work on each day will be seen by players? This morale impact is the element of PlayStation's lost generation that is hardest to quantify, but it's an element that's affecting the landscape of PlayStation studios nonetheless. After all this info, I think it's clear why I call this PlayStation's lost generation. Not because the games they've put out on PS5 are bad, or because they're not selling systems, but because the year's worth of work from many of their teams have been lost. The PS5 has seen the lowest first and second party output of any Sony home console to date, and these cancellations only make that even more dire. In a world where none of these projects had been abandoned, we would have seen more than a half dozen more releases, including multiple new IP, come out during the generation, which would have solved some of the issues the hardcore PlayStation fanbase has had with PS5. Despite all of the decisions confusingly made, games frustratingly cancelled, and studios heartbreakingly closed, I do want to end on a positive note. It's clear that, at least to some degree, co-CEOs Herman Hulst and Hideaki Nishino are listening to feedback, especially after the financial failure of Concord. The PlayStation community has worried for years that all we would see from Sony was live service games, but clearly that's not the case anymore. It's disappointing to know that we won't see games from Bend or Bluepoint for years, and heartbreaking to consider the lost effort put into projects at Naughty Dog and Firesprite, but hopefully things are healing. These teams that survived this rocky time period can now refocus their efforts back onto the games they do best and build towards a healthier future for PlayStation. Living through this tumultuous era has been a wild ride for both fans and especially the developers, but all we can hope for is that these mistakes have been learned from going into the PS6. If you want to learn more about the video game development process, check out my series Dev Dive, where almost every week I go in depth with a video game developer to talk about their creative process. There's a lot of great insights there, and I've talked to a lot of interesting creators. The guy who made El Paso Elsewhere, the guy who made Wilmot's Warehouse, the guy who made Castle Crashers, Peglin, 1000 Times Resist. I've got all sorts of great stuff, and I really think you guys would enjoy it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.